Wonderful. It's Mr. Martinez here. I just wanted to give you all a quick lecture on Chapter 2. There's some things that we didn't cover and I think that are going to be really important as we continue to move on through this book. So I just wanted to touch on some key ideas and make sure that we are staying focused on some of these ideas as the book and the story continue from here on out. As we kind of learned through that activity that we did last class, the comedian had a fairly important influence on multiple characters. In fact, regardless of what these characters thought about the comedian or what we even think about the comedian as readers, we are supposed to understand, something Alan Moore wants us to understand, is that he is someone who works as a catalyst, right? And just like a catalyst, he speeds the action up, right? Or he influences in a way that allows other characters and their actions to sort of speed up, okay? So that's really important. I think we kind of saw that, particularly with the individualized flashbacks, while each character, minus Laurie, were at the funeral, and we sort of saw those different perspectives fly out, right? So remember that in the funeral, we had these particular reflections on the comedian and how they influenced each character. And that each of these reflections that they had, we noticed that it kind of laid the root or the seed for how the characters were later going to act, right? And possibly for how they're going to act in this new present after the funeral, right? But just very briefly, I know that Laurie wasn't at the funeral, but one of the things that after her mother reflected on those particular moments she had with the comedian, we understand one of the questions we're supposed to ask ourselves is how badly do past events affect how we feel about those particular events in the future, particularly if those events are painfully personal, right? The almost rape that happened to Sally was so strong of an event that it sort of carried down to her daughter and affected the way that her daughter viewed the comedian, right? If we think about Adrian Veidt and his particular reflection, we understand that the comedian showed off a particular kind of cynicism at that Minutemen meeting. And that particular cynicism, we can see, kind of triggered something in Adrian's mind. Not quite sure what, but something in Adrian's mind when the comedian was talking about what it takes to save the world, right? And just sort of it might be worth reviewing what the comedian is doing as he's saying those words, or what he's just done at that meeting, right? Because something is triggered in Adrian's mind. For Dr. Manhattan in Vietnam, that flashback in Vietnam, we see that it's the first time Dr. Manhattan is forced to question his own detachment from humanity. The comedian has the ability to make him think about himself, right? That particular action. Dr. Manhattan could have stopped that bullet, but he didn't. And so it's the first time that Dr. Manhattan, had to think specifically how he's actually helping humanity, or is he helping humanity, which hopefully you will explore in Chapter 3 and Chapter 4, offers a different explanation or expands on those ideas. Finally, it's Dan's flashback that sort of forces us and forces Dan to question the role of the superhero. And he sort of asks that question: to what extent does a superhero get in the way or even cause the very problems they are attempting to solve? And I think that's one of the questions, that's one of the struggles Dan has, as we're going to see, is that the comedian became this really violent superhero where he was harming the citizens that they were supposed to save, right? So all of these different thoughts, even though they were burying the comedian, it was almost like they were unburying old ideas, which may or may not have an influence on the rest of the story. So that's something that I want us to think about, those particular questions. Another thing I want us to point out, I know it's a struggle for some of you to get through the white pages, but there are three main points I want you to think about in regards to those the second excerpt from Hollis Mason's Under the Hood. First question, or first purpose of that, I think, was that it lists out all of the main players of the Minutemen. So if we're trying to complete that character map that we had designed a couple weeks ago, this is the chapter that informs us the rest of the characters of the Minutemen, kind of outlines who they were, how they came to be, and also why they failed, because it was a failed group, and I think that's actually fairly important for understanding where the rest of the story is going to go. Number two, it kind of, the excerpt also outlines how Hollis Mason stumbled into his name and costume, and the way that Hollis Mason describes this is again hinting at how moments in the story are kind of rooted, or trying to be rooted, and trying to ground the graphic novel in reality. So it might be worth looking at the details that Hollis Mason provides in establishing his identity as the Night Owl, right? The last thing, and I think the most important thing, and this piggybacks off of Dan's question, what the comedian made Dan think about, Hollis Mason seems to have this really dark and almost ashamed view of superheroes as they stand, particularly as he's writing this book. And I think what's important, one of the important things, is that he asks the question if superheroes are actually responsible for the mess the world is in today. And he says those words at the top of page 9 of the excerpt, right? And I think that's a really important question, is that superheroes are meant to be created to save the world. But Alan Moore, I think, is really wanting us to think about that question. If they were brought into reality, or if we're to consider them in our reality now, are they actually helping us, or are they harming us more, right? Okay, so those are just a couple of things I want us to keep in mind as we continue, right? Thank you.